the next session connects really, really well to a lot that we've been talking about so far today. It's about making justice work, creating intergenerational, intercultural movements, bringing people together. So this is, in a sense, terrain that you've already heard about earlier today. But of course, now we have new speakers. So it's interesting to see their perspectives. And two of them are online on Zoom. So they're already here. So if you can turn on your cameras, and that's wonderful. So I start with you, Jakob. Nice to see you. Jakob Blasel, he's with Fridays for, thank you. Fridays for Future, Germany, and he's a climate activist. He started the school strike movement in Germany, and also, of course, climate marches in the streets in Germany, still very active, no longer in high school, but keeping up the fight alive. And then we also have, dialing in from Germany, Tobias März. Hello, Tobias. Thank you for joining us. Wonderful. It's already, of course, this is like prime time in Germany already. It's like Friday evening. So thank you so much for making time now and socializing with us here online. And Tobias is with the Letzte Generation, last generation. It's a movement that I don't think is active here in the US, but you can tell, I mean, Tobias can tell us more about it. It's more focused on what I would call direct action. So it's like a little bit more in the front line, so to speak. So thank you both for being here. And of course, I want to ask our in-room speakers also. We don't have everybody here. So we have Zanagee, Artis, please join us. Wonderful. With 0 Hour. This also wonderful to have you here. You're one of the founders of 0 Hour and also a climate activist. Here, actually, the most local speaker we have in the lineup, apart from Katrin Sieg. But so thank you so much. And if I can say, you came here by e-bike, is that correct? Wonderful, yeah. Wonderful. So we're all impressed, and that's of course, and it's beautiful weather for that too. So great. And then of course, we want to also invite Sharon back to the stage one more time, if you may. Yes, wonderful. So have you met Sharon before? Zanagee, have you met? You have. So it's like, well, wonderful. Oh, so you know each other. I didn't know. I didn't want to repeat, like it's not a rerun, I hope. But at least Jakob and Tobias, they're new. And so in that sense, it's a new conversation. Yeah. So this is our setup. You can turn your chairs whichever way you want, so you can see the speakers. They can see you. There's a camera there where they can see you. And then, of course, we will also, hopefully be able to interact in this hybrid panel. So I wanted to ask you, I mean, the session is about making justice work. And so I'll ask questions to all of you, and you can maybe not all at once, but come in and share your ideas. Well, the first thing is, I mean, we talked a lot. We need to mobilize more people. We need to get people, you know, out of their sofas. So how do you create a movement? And how do you start? Where do you start? Whoever, Jakob, if you want to go first.
I can go first. I think you can discuss about how to create a movement in Washington but you cannot start a movement here, and you cannot start a movement in the middle of Berlin. You can start a movement where the people are, and you can start a movement only with the people who are angry about what's going on, who are concerned about what's going on, who care about what's going on. And a movement is also about not like some people have to take the lead, but it's also a lot about following. Like Max, you said I started the climate strike movement.
So I think, Jakob, our Wi-Fi got stuck.
Oh no,
I think
where
that's
did it
on
get
our
stuck?
end. If you can hear me, we just lost you there at the very end. When you said it's not just about leaders, it's also about following.
Yes, it's also about following. Like you said, Max, you said I started the climate strike movement in Germany, but to be specific, I didn't. I followed the climate strike movement in Sweden because I was inspired by what Greta Thunberg did when she sat in front of the Swedish parliament striking school every day, and what she said at the Global Climate Conference. And so I think starting a movement is not really hard. Making a movement big and impactful, that's the hard part. And doing that starts with following, inspiring people, and making a good idea a reality.
Thank you, thank you. And if any of you, if you want to follow up Zanagee or Tobias, don't be shy just because I didn't address you. You can come in and share your thoughts. Like what do you think in your perspective here in the capital region? I mean, Jakob just said you can't start a movement here, but you're of course you're a DC-ish person, but you're not one of these people on the hill. So that's of course you're one of the real people really living here. So what's your view?
Yeah, thank you. So I think so. I started organizing when I was in high school. We started Zero Hour in July of 2017, and then in 2018 we led the Youth Climate March here in Washington D.C. and in 25 locations around the world. And we did that because we wanted young people to have a space in the movement that was youth-led and that centered people who were being impacted by the climate crisis and by the fossil fuel industry. But we didn't know what we were doing when we started. Similar to Jakob, we were following the lead of people who have been in this movement for so many years, who are dedicating their careers to environmental justice. And so we had so much to learn from people who have been doing this for years. And we're honored to be a part of making this movement intergenerational and supporting work that has been happening for so long. But I think that the entry point to organizing is knowledge and is learning about what actually can be done, what policies that we need, what communities impacted by fossil fuels are calling for. And yeah, it's all about environmental education and learning from people who are doing the work.
Great, great. Yeah. So I like that too about the intergenerational aspect. And of course, Tobias, I mean, what do you think? How do you get, I mean, you have a slightly different form of organization that you're affiliated with. And how do you get people to participate, to join this, to also basically to trust you, right? People have to bring a little bit of trust. There's a little bit of risk with some of the activities. Yeah, what's your approach there?
Yeah, thank you, Max. And also thank you for being invited here. I hope you can hear me well. It worked really well. I can see Sharon and Z on the panel, and I can see Jakob. I can hear you well. It's really good setup. Yeah, I think different where you start a movement and what the is. For example, what Sharon is doing locally with the atrocities happening there. It's vivid and plastic for the people, what's going wrong. And so you have, then I guess you have to get people on the streets and motivate them to do something. But it's already very present, that there's these, I don't know, oil or coal companies doing stuff that is wrong, that you can see is wrong. Whereas here in Germany, I find it's much more difficult because people are like, the climate crisis is impacting, but it's the atrocities, the red stuff is happening on television, somewhere in Africa or elsewhere. And it's, for most people, it's still a very abstract thing here, the climate crisis, and people step on the street something about it. It's quite a big step if you're not personally concerned. So the approach that last generation is taking is quite a radical one, you can say, or like a very consequent one, using civil disobedience or civil resistance, like Martin Luther King has been doing in the USA, or the suffragettes in Europe for getting the right for women to vote. So this thing of going to the street and breaking certain rules to show that a bigger injustice is happening, and by people taking that risk, for example, here in Germany, we a typical thing we do. It's not the only thing we do, but the most known probably is where we block streets so that the cars can't move, and then it takes some time for the police to take the people down from the street, and obviously they take you to court and you have to suffer police treatment and so forth. But it's very plastic. It captures people's attention, and it's also it gives us the opportunity to voice this thing about the climate crisis, which is, as I said, very far away for many people. So it's a very specific approach. And for me personally, I'm 40 plus years. I have a family, I have a job. I work with solar power. So I was already involved kind of in climate change in a broader sense. But for me, it captured me because it's like a very strategic approach, the approach to directly put pressure on the government and have a plan, have very motivated people creating structures so that people can do this thing. That's what mobilized me and many others. So maybe that's what I can share so far and give the voice to Sharon.
Thank you, Tobias. Yeah, Sharon. Yeah.
Yes. When I started, I didn't have anyone to motivate me. First of all, we didn't know what we were doing. First of all, we called a meeting. That's the first thing we did. Call a meeting in my den at my house. And we were fired up, and we wanted this plant to go away. Then the second meeting we had it in my garage. And we organized from there. People came and they joined with us. We did marches, went to parish council meetings, and we protest. And we mobilized our community, got people to come to the meetings, speak about what's going on, speak about what they wanted in our community. And it just flew. It just went like wildfire. And we've been going ever since. So we had no model. We had no one to talk to. Just went out there and we did it. Didn't know anything. That's how we got started. And we started to organize the community.
That's great. Yeah, you just have to have that moment. Yeah. And was there, for you personally, was there a moment when you thought about doing this, but we're still not quite there? Or what snapped it?
Never thought about doing any of this work. Never in my life. I was teaching school. I enjoyed teaching school, and that was my life. And I didn't know people did this type of work. All I knew was the plant wasn't coming 2 miles from my home, and we went on that. And people started to join after that. Our public officials didn't like it. Too bad.
Well, we can't always agree with everybody, right? So this is the idea of protest, I guess. Yeah, wonderful. No, and Tobias, you said already that for you this was kind of like a natural continuation in a way of, the steps. Of course, then also the question to Jakob and Zanagee, how it was for you. I mean, where did this, I mean, you said what inspired you, but was this a breaking point, like a, you know, a catharsis moment, or was this just you were always in a way active in civil, not only disobedience, but like expression of your voice, and it was just a natural next step for you?
I think there I think it's quite different, especially for us younger people. In the last decades, there was always kind of a promise of infinitely growing wealth and prosperity, especially in Germany at least, and I think in the US maybe as well. And this promise...
Jakob, I think our Wi-Fi cut you off, but we heard, especially in Germany.
I think this promise was broken. This promise of long-lasting wealth and indefinite opportunities. And when I grew up, I realized quickly that all these opportunity, all this safe haven the world and the society is supposed to be, can't really be kept. Like, this promise can't really be kept. And so I think all this insecurity kind of influenced how young people think about the climate crisis, but also about the whole world who is going from crisis to another crisis right now. And I think that really impacts how young people think about it. And I think there are two different approaches, and I wouldn't even judge which one is the right one to do, to become cynical or to do something about it.
Jakob, we lost you again for a second there. You said you don't want to judge which approach is the right one to do. And what came after that?
Yes, to be cynical about it or to do something about it. And I personally chose to do something about it. And I ask everyone else to do something about it. But I think we also have to understand people who don't feel like there is much to do, who are desperate. And I think those are the people we need to reach.
Yeah. No, that's a very good point. And of course, the question is, how do you reach them? But also, like, you know, you said some people are cynical. They turn to cynicism or they don't care. So how do you reach them when they have this shield up? And I mean, this question goes to all of you. Basically, how do you reach people who don't want to hear the truth, basically?
I can talk about that a little bit. I think that, so when I started organizing, I really didn't feel like I was being impacted by climate change. I had very little environmental education growing up. The first class that I took on it was in college. And but I had started organizing because of a story from one of our co-founders, Jamie Margolin. And I met her in the summer of 2017 when she pitched this idea of a youth climate march. And she talked about how she had to stay indoors for most of the summer in Seattle, Washington, because of wildfires across Canada. And that was wild to me. I grew up on the coast of Connecticut, and we experienced Hurricane Sandy and Hurricane Irene, but now those were the worst storms that I'd experienced, and they weren't as bad because New York and Long Island took the brunt of that damage, of that disaster. And so for me, I thought that plastic pollution was the biggest problem. I thought that, you know, recycling more, eliminating plastic bottles and styrofoam was the best thing I could possibly do on the climate. Then I learned about environmental injustice and fossil fuels and how so many people have no choice but to live around the most polluted sites in this country. And that the fossil fuel industry is intentionally placing these facilities in communities that are just sacrifice zones, that the Biden administration, that our government does not value enough to stop industry coming into. And I think that for a lot of people right now, they still don't feel like climate change is affecting them. And if climate change is not your motivation, then I think that it's also important to note that there are people living around pollution that is affecting human health. Like, climate is a major problem, but the impact of the fossil fuel industry on people's lives immediately surrounding these polluting sites is also a motivation. And the more that we hear stories of people like Sharon, who's been organizing in her own community against fossil fuels, I think the more we can inspire people to take action.
Thank you. Thank you. And of course, our Zoom speakers, don't feel like you can't just come in if you want to say something anytime. And Tobias, yeah, we have questions in the room. So we do have a wandering microphone. So if you want to ask our panelists anything, please.
Well, actually, can I jump in with a question myself? Because one of the things that I found really fascinating here in all four responses is when you talk about how do you get people, how do you overcome the cynicism or how this reluctance or this reticence to get engaged or involved. And I heard a lot about invitations, inviting people. Sharon, you mentioned that you had a meeting at your house, you invited people to your house. And Tobias is talking about we have these very specific direct actions and we invite people to them. And Jakob, you were talking about this as well, this idea of inviting people into it, bringing people into the conversation. I think that's one of the big things that gets lost here is that outreach to individual people. So I wanted to ask, how do you sort of frame your actions or your activities? How do you frame the way that you take action about climate change or about environmental justice? How do you frame that so that people connect to it, how that they feel like they can participate and they can make a difference by attending your meeting, by doing a direct action, so that it doesn't feel like a small thing that has no ability to deal with the larger concept?
And that's to all of
That's to everyone, but Tobias in particular, I would love to hear, because what you're talking about often are these people might consider the actions to be putting themselves at risk, which of course we're already all at risk, right? But how do you communicate? How do you make those kinds of direct actions amenable or accessible, or how do you communicate them so people feel like they can participate, that they want to?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, you're right. These direct action things are very specific, and not everybody is up for that. So in one sense, it's a bigger step to do that kind of thing. You know, confronting police and maybe a trial and so forth, and putting your body, your person at risk at times also maybe. But on the other side, it's also very empowering, I find, because there you do see the result, right? Like, takes just a handful of people to block a street, and I know not everybody likes this approach, and there's many discussions about it, but you see the effect. It's on the local press, it's in national press, and we did have some really big coverage, and we invited to big TV shows as well, and so where we can then transport the message. So in that sense, we're giving people the possibility to do make a have an impact. And I think that's, for me also, that's very powerful to know that it's a very specific thing for one day or for this situation.
So
I decide to do the step, but then you see the effect.
At the very end here, you said for you it's also important to know, and then we lost you.
Yeah, I mean, basically that it's a bigger step for people than other things, but to do this direct action. But at the same time, it's empowering because you see the direct impact, right? You see people. It's on the media, on the local media, national media. We get invited to different shows. We're on the in the newspapers, so and there we can put our message. So we really see the impact of what you're doing, and that's very empowering also. And maybe in terms of invitation, what you said, so around all that, we try to create a space as safe as possible for people. So having an awareness team, having emotional support before and after, having good trainings before the actions, follow up after the action, legal support, so all kinds of support so that people can really feel safe to do that. Yeah.
Great. No, wonderful. And I wanted to hear, because both of you mentioned marches as being also important for your own, I would say, like process development in terms of activism, but also, of course, for getting other people to join and to see and notice. And I wanted to hear more how you see marches as an important tool, and whether there's also whether people have concern about joining a march, be it for, the fear of confrontation with police or other people, or just that not being their way of expression that they're used to, and how you try to overcome this or dissuade concerns. So I don't know if you, Sharon, want to come in, because you have done marches locally and at the national scale. So
first of all, you have to know why you want to have a march. That's the first thing. Just don't get out there and just march. We always have an objective. We always plan it. We talk to the police department to let them know where we're going to be marching. When I had my first march, he told me that we couldn't march on the highway because the Sunshine Bridge was being constructed. So I didn't know any better. So we marched on the sidewalk. I bet the second time we had a march, he couldn't tell me that because I knew better. Could march on the highway. He knew that I didn't know. So second time came, the people said, we can't march on the highway. I said, oh, yes, we can. I went to the police department and I told him where we was going to march, and we marched. If you don't know the law, they can tell you anything. You have to educate yourself. You have to get out there and know why you're going to mobilize. You just can't get out there and just start doing things. You have to have a reason. We got on the phone, we had calls, and we planned it, and we did everything right. We had the police escorts in front of us and behind us. So you have to know what you want to do, explain it to the public, teach the public, and they will come join with you. Just can't just go out there and do things, but I always follow the law whenever I did something. Always did.
Great. Yeah, and I don't know how it was for you being in marches and what it meant for your willingness to go further.
Yeah, I think I definitely echo what was just said. I think that the more you know, the better you can be at organizing. So when I first started, I had the fortune of connecting with someone who had been organizing in Washington, D.C. for a long time, and navigating the permitting process for a march here in Washington, D.C. is really interesting because there are 3 different police departments that you have to go through. You have to get a permit from the Capitol Police if you're in the Capitol vicinity, the Metropolitan Police, and the Park Service. And that was a lot. And then we had to block off streets and all of this background. But what people should know if they're interested in going to a march is that often, like, all of this work has been happening for several months in the lead up. So there will be police presence there. If it's a permitted march, you will have access to porta potties and medical assistance and all of these things to ensure that the protest actually happens in the way it's supposed to, and that the demands are actually the front and center, and that not some other random thing that happens to happen on the day. And I'll also say that I think I grew up with a lot of privilege, having grown up in Connecticut and not having lived near fossil fuels. I lived in the woods, on the shoreline. I had access to nature. And for so many people, it is a privilege to not take action on climate. It's a privilege to choose not to join a protest, because there are so many people who are protesting because they have to, because these issues are impacting their own communities. And so that's why I always try to go to any march that I can, any protest that I can, even if it's in a region that's not affecting me. I joined a protest against the Mountain Valley pipeline that is affecting Appalachia in the United States. Joined protests for the Gulf South, for Alaska, places that I've never been, and yet they need solidarity and they need support from people across the country, because we've seen time and time again that without mass pressure from people all across the country and around the world, the Biden administration and governments around the world will not listen. They will choose the fossil fuel industry, and we need mass movement mobilizing to act on climate change.
Thank you, Zanagee. Thank you. I wanted to ask to our speakers on the German side, and then also to you, the question whether you think there's been like a change happening or not, whether it's getting more difficult in some ways to express your opposition. You mentioned it is difficult as a starting point already because of all the administrative barriers. But if you observe a change there, and especially we've seen that some of the media coverage, of course, of climate protests is changing in tone, and whether you think that this is something you perceive on your end as well, or whether that's more where the media focuses on right now, and not so much the reality.
Yeah, I think it's like I can only say this for Germany. I'm not in the American debate enough to say this for the US, but I think the debate really shifted from being about if climate action is necessary to how do we do it? What is the best approach? And what is the most just approach? And when we get to those details, the unity and the support in the broader society of the climate movement is kind of shifting away, and people start asking questions about how to heat houses without gas and so on. And we have good scientific answers for that. There are good concepts out there, but people in a broader society, not even people who don't support our cause, get increasingly insecure. And in that time, and I think civil disobedience is a really important tool and has been in the past to get change. But in that time, media attention is not the only tool to persuade people and not the only tool to make change. I think it's more about organizing unity and organizing a community around fights where there's a clear front line against fossil fuels, against permission of wrong projects like Keystone and many other things that are going on in the world. And I think getting back to those fights who are clear, where there's a clear answer, is really a good tool to rally support around an issue.
Great. Yeah, I like this focus on unity or community. And funny how you say this, because the words are overlapping significantly. Didn't occur to me, but that's really good. Tobias, yeah, what's your take on the situation, or is there a trend, or?
Yeah, I would agree with Jakob that we need I would call it an alliance, a big civil society alliance of organizations and people who stand together and say, this is what we want, so that there's sufficient pressure in one direction on the government so that they
Tobias,
start to move.
Sorry, we heard this is what we want, and then it cut off.
Yeah.
This is what we want? Sorry.
A sufficiently large civil society alliance that says this is what we want and puts the government under pressure so that they act. Because at the moment it's still the easier way out for the politicians to say, yes, we're doing something, and then finding the smallest, common sense that they can find to do something, but still not really have a plan and have a master plan for how to actually avoid the climate tipping points, for example, that the IPCC describes, and really come down with emissions within this decade. So for them, it's easier to slip away and say, yes, we're doing something, but then, not really acting. So I agree with Jakob, this big alliance needs to be there. I personally find it really hard to create, because this public conversation is always very limited on a very low level. Like, for example, in Germany, we had the minister for energy and also on climate in general. They brought up a law for what Jakob was mentioning, heating houses, like a renovation of what is allowed as your central heating. And it was a really good initiative, but then the more conservative media took it and kind of ripped it in the air and said, had a whole campaign of why this is bad and why that guy wants to mess up with all our houses and our private life and so forth. So it created a lot of confusion and anger against the government. And in this environment, where the attention span is so short and people are so polarized, it's really hard to come to this common sense. But I agree with Jakob that needs to be the goal, to have a strong alliance and big common sense, and then put the pressure. This is what we need now.
Probably comparable to the American gas stove debate, I think.
Yeah, that's also a good one. We have a few of those here. Also, the offshore windmills that kill the whales. But Zanagee, you mentioned also a certain level of maybe not frustration, but well, at least you don't seem to be fully satisfied with the performance at the federal level. So where do you direct your, because you're in the capital region, do you direct your attention mostly towards the federal level, or is that to local governments or state governments? Or do you say we just have to build this big coalition of like-minded people that Tobias and Jakob were talking about, and then we have the power that we need? What's your focus? If you have to pick one, of course, you can also be in all of those.
Yeah, so at 0 Hour, I work on federal policy on fossil fuels and working to end the expansion of fossil fuels on federal lands and waters. And we do have chapters that work in our states and localities and countries elsewhere in the world, but I choose to focus on federal policy advocacy because there is so much more potential than we are seeing for our federal government to take action on climate change. And we saw the linking of fossil fuel leasing on public lands and waters to the leasing for renewable energy in the Inflation Reduction Act, which means that we have to lease millions and millions of acres of our public lands and waters for fossil fuels before we can even get started leasing for offshore wind and solar farms and wind facilities on land. And so that's a huge issue. A fourth of fossil fuels in the US come from public lands, and these are for the public. And we are calling for no new fossil fuels on public lands, but also the federal government can phase out fossil fuels by revoking permits. They can end export of fossil fuels. We are on track to become a net exporter, and yet we are reaching record-breaking production year after year and sending those emissions abroad. And yes, there is an energy crisis happening because of war, but to say that energy security is in fossil fuels is simply false. We know that renewable energy is more sustainable, it is more economically viable, and less expensive for consumers. And so we are advocating at the federal level to do that work because it will have national impact.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and there's of course always this interplay when people can also, put the blame on other people. But in the end, everybody is responsible, including us. So this is, I think, the important thing here, which everybody is part of it. And so, yeah, there's definitely like a lot of missed opportunity in that regard for phasing down and out fossil fuels. And that brings us, of course, also back to Louisiana, where a lot is then also either processed there or then shipped out of the country. And Sharon, I know you have to leave in just a few minutes, actually, but I wanted to give you the opportunity to share your thoughts about how we can move further and forward together, both in the US, but also globally, and any recommendations you have for that.
I think that just like you said, we need to stop giving permits to these industries, especially the ones that come from out of the country. A lot of them do. That's the first step. Our federal government, our governor in Louisiana, he go out of the country to recruit new industries to come into our state. That's what we need to stop. That's why we have so much increasing hurricanes, floods, I guess wildfires, I would guess. So we need to start with the federal government and come on down to the local government, because they are the reasons why we're going through these things. They are the reason why we are suffering right now. That's why my home was destroyed in 2021 from the hurricane. We never had hurricanes that so intense where it took the roof off people's homes. We have homes right now, still have tarps on the homes. Some people lost their mobile homes. It just turned over. We lost a lot of trees, a lot of infrastructure. It's a lot of things that we lost. Our hurricane that we had in 21 was their Katrina when they had it back in whatever year it was. I forgot what year. It was on the same date, August the 29th, that we had the same hurricane like they had in New Orleans. And I blame the federal government. I blame our local government for doing these things to us, because they are going after their pockets, the pocketbooks. It's greed. They don't care about what's going on within the communities, in the state. They want the money. The hell with our lives. They don't care about us. So it starts from the federal coming on down, and we need to do something about it. We need to stand together, try to get the laws changed.
Thank you. Thank you, Sharon.